Okay, it is 1 o'clock. Let's get started. We've got a pretty packed agenda here. Welcome to the second meeting of MailMaint. Unless this is your first session of the week, you've all probably seen the note well before. It covers the IETF policies on conduct, privacy, and IPR. Please go there and read the links. Furthermore, we have a non-harassment policy. Please be civil. We can disagree, but don't be disagreeable. If you feel you're being harassed, contact a member of the ombuds team. Make sure everybody here in the room checks in with at least the on-site tool. If you're remote, please keep yourself muted until you are allowed in the queue. Please use headphones. I'm sure you've all heard this before. There's some links to the agenda, issues if you have any issues with Meet Echo, all those good things. And here's our agenda. Bron has graciously agreed to be our scribe. Thank you, Bron. Here's our agenda. We're going to briefly cover the expires draft and the wrong recipient URL draft, probably both by John. I don't believe David is. Oh, he is. Okay. Okay. You're going to speak on behalf of that draft. Okay. Ben's going to do a presentation on the auto config stuff that we've been discussing. And we've got some new proposed work. Arndt is going to get back into SMTP UT8 stuff. Neil is going to talk about registering some new keywords and mailbox names. Neil's also going to talk about a OAuth profile for email and calendars and contacts. And then Bron is going to talk about the DKIM2 stuff that he briefly mentioned yesterday in the plenary. Anybody want to bash this agenda before we get going? Hearing none. John, you want to cover expires and wrong recipient?
Well, I'm going to say the same thing twice, so I should probably define this as a macro first.
Okay.
But I can't help it if this mic is designed for short people. Anyway, yeah. For the which one should I do first?
Expires. Okay, yeah.
For the expires draft, I thought we were pretty much done until this morning. Richard Clayton from Yahoo sent us an email message saying that he thought it was unlikely that Yahoo would implement it in the current form. And since I happen to know he talks to all the people at the other large mail providers, I think his concerns were reasonable. So I want to go back and talk to him and some other people at large providers,
okay,
and see if we can resolve the issues. So that's it for expires.
Okay. One piece of clarification: you actually intend to change the wording in terms of not being able to delete without user's consent from a should not, or not recommended, or whatever the existing word it was, to a must not, correct?
Yeah, although Richard's concerns had nothing to do with that.
Okay.
It was more like it wasn't clear. It echoed issues that had come up before. It's like, what does expires mean? And so,
okay.
But I think that we can probably address this with non-normative text to say, if it's a coupon, it means this, and if it's a password reset, it means that.
Okay.
Yeah, I can ask if he was. Yeah, I can ask him if I am paraphrasing him accurately.
Richard, is John echoing your concerns accurately?
Pretty much. What I will say is that somebody else asked on the list a while ago, who's going to implement this? And nobody ever stepped forward and said, we will. So the fact we're saying we won't is just an indication that nobody is saying they will.
Yep. Thank you. I was going to ask that question towards the end here.
I haven't seen this before. Does this mean that expires means the email is no longer relevant after a certain date? Is that correct? I would implement that.
Okay. Who are you?
Yes. I'm speaking for Mustang, it's a new email client.
Alexi.
Yeah, we had lots of senders were ready to implement it, but Richard is obviously correct that if inbound mail providers aren't ready to do it, we need to work on it.
And per our charter, we can't take this to last call unless we actually have some implementations that interoperate.
Yeah. Okay. Now,
Yeah, Alexi's behind you.
right.
Hi, Alexei Melnikov. We have implemented this for the last 10 years.
Okay.
So both. Yeah, I just added it to our webmail. It's just display only thing for the most part.
Great. So if we get someone else to implement, to test against you.
Yeah,
we need-
absolutely. Yeah.
So John, why don't you come up with some text you think addresses the concerns? And then when the updated draft gets posted, we'll comment on the list.
Yeah, now that we have 2 implementers and 1 non-implementer, I have some people to talk to, so I should be able to do that. Okay. Now, with respect to the not me button, let me just repeat everything I just said very quickly. I was until Richard said they're not going to implement that either, and he brought up an issue that had come up before, which is that a message can have an unsubscribe or it can have a not me. It's hard to come up with a situation where it would have both. You know, they don't think it's not reasonable to try to put both buttons on the MUA. So his suggestion is that since you're going to have one or the other, is there some way we can combine them? So they are
Okay.
at least, yeah, so they're at least syntactically the same, and we can sort of scratch our heads whether we want to put some sort of semantic hint about which one it is, or whether we should just say your transactional mail should have an unsubscribe, but you should interpret it as not me. But again, we can go back and talk to people and see if that will make them happier to implement it.
Marie, are you in the queue or is that a mistake? Okay.
Neil Jenkins. Yeah, I always view this as that it's like the transactional equivalent of list unsubscribe. So whether it's combined into one thing where you can add an extra tag or they're separate, doesn't matter too much. Yeah, you'd never have both, I don't think. And I guess it's just, again, knowing that the sender believes this is a transactional mail rather than a subscription could help the client present things. But other than that, it's identical in flow, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That whether the text says, you know, did you subscribe to this, or are you the wrong recipient? Yeah, but yeah, you're right. Technically, it's all the same. So yeah, well, so same thing. We'll go back and see if we can find people happier to implement.
Sounds good. Marie, do you have a comment? Oh, at the end. Yes.
Minor administrative point. The milestone for expires and for this is set to February. You want to leave them there, or do you want to move them out?
We'll probably push them out.
Okay.
In terms of implementers of this, once it gets redesigned, I think, Neil, you said you would be interested at some point. Yeah. Anybody else in the room interested in implementing this? Ben, Alexi? Okay. Looks like we have a few there. Excellent. Okay. Next. Oh, go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
Just a minor comment versus list versus not me. These are semantically different, and I would handle them in the client in a different way. I need to know, for example, whether this is an email list, how I present the reply to button. So this has other implications. If it's an actual mailing list, which goes to many recipients, but has implications for the sender. So they're semantically different, so not to mix them.
The unsubscribe is typically on marketing mail, which is where everybody gets a separate copy. So it's not, you know, like if you reply, it might go back to the advertiser. It's not going to go back to the other people who get the similar mail. Yeah. Okay.
Ron.
I would hope you could look for the list ID header to decide what to display without needing to add additional semantics.
Did you want to respond to that, Neil? Or...
Yeah, Neil. Just briefly, I agree. I think it would be lovely if everything did have a list ID header, if it was like lists you subscribe to rather than transactional mail, but often they don't, because the only thing that Google and Yahoo enforce is it has the list unsubscribe, not that it has a list ID. So often they just have a list unsubscribe. And the biggest annoyance with that is if you unsubscribe from something, it's not obvious. Like if you open another message that was from the same thread, from the same list in the client, you can't know that that was the same list, and that you should have unsubscribed to that as well. And it'd be really nice if there was a list ID to tie all those together.
Anything else? Oh, I see Pete.
Pete Resnick. I said in the chat room, if folks think that they're not going to implement both list unsubscribe and this, why don't we ditch this, create a parameter to list unsubscribe, which can indicate to the client how it should present to the user, and just use the same field and be done with it. Yeah, it seems perfectly reasonable.
Will that mess with existing implementations of list unsubscribe? Will they be able to handle the parameter without breaking? Would be my question. They should be able to, but will they? Okay. Anything else on wrong recipient? Oh, Richard.
I'd just like to say that I have recently looked at list ID headers in real email at scale, and there's a very large number of people out there who have not read the RFC and have no idea what is meant to be there. And then what they do in some cases is they put a unique identifier in there. So every single email is apparently a separate list. So if we're going to use list ID, then a whole lot of people are going to have to clean up their act, because currently it is useless.
All right, thank you for that information, Richard. Okay, anything else? Can we close that topic and move on? Okay, Ben with autoconfig.
So I'm Ben Buchsch. I worked 25 years on Thunderbird. Now we're creating our own email client. Just a little background. Probably most people here know it, but Thunderbird has been using autoconfig since 2008 around. That was a problem that we had, that the user had to manually configure the email client with IMAP servers and username form and authentication methods. And that was unfeasible. So I invented this protocol where we're trying to figure out what is a configuration in a more authoritative way. Instead of looking at capabilities, IMAP capabilities, we found out that they don't actually most of the time wrong. And we didn't want to do guesswork. So we had a protocol which is querying first the ISP directly via a well-known URL, HTTP. Can we just maybe go to the first slide?
Sure.
It's querying HTTPS autoconfig.domain to give the ISP a chance to directly respond with the correct configuration. If that fails, because for the big ISPs it usually fails, they don't support this, we go to the ISP database where we have a list of the big internet providers. Almost every internet provider, email provider with a market share of more than 0.1% is in that database. Failing that, for the customer domains, we have for domain hosters, we look up the MX and then look up in the ISPDB. The format is based on XML. It works very well. 60% of the accounts can be covered by the ISPDB, 10 more by the MX, and about 10 with the autoconfig. So in total, we have a success rate between 80 and 95%. However, this was not invented here. So there was some discussions about this because it's using this autoconfig domain name. There's a well-known following that, but people said, no, we don't want that. And it's not based on DNS server. So for the moment, the idea is apparently to make this, the idea was to make it a standards track RC, but we shifted gears. Apparently, it's going to be an informational RC. You have the draft here, and it's pretty much ready for publishing. There is one more revision coming out where I'm fixing up some things. Does anybody know how we're supposed to specify XML formats in RCs? I have an example there, which pretty much covers everything. Am I supposed to do something else on top of that? I could deliver an XSD, but am I going to paste it in there, or is it an attachment? If anybody knows, a quick answer.
It's John Levine. In the DMARC RFCs, we have there is an where there's an XML reporting format. There is an XSD, which is not actually. It's pretty clear nobody actually reads it. So yeah, but I think it would be useful to put in an XSD. If you mark it as code, then it can be automatically.
It's going to be long.
Oh, it can be very long. Yeah, but since since RFCs are formatted in XML, like they're basically it's you put in the RFC XML, you can put code tags to say this is XSD, which means that people can extract it mechanically if they want to. So I think it's worth putting in the XSD just because some people use it, even if not everybody uses it.
We can ask the RFC editor. Go
Okay.
get downstairs. Take that offline.
So that's this. Next, can you go on? Thank you. So both formats work pretty much in the same, have the same principle. In the user agent flow, the whole thing starts with the user entering his real name, like Ben Bush or Daniel something, and his email address. And we just go as the only information of the email address, and we take the domain, everything after the ad. And then this is now the new format that just came up last week that we worked on something in a group. It's proposal as an alternative. It works on DNS server. So this first underscore there, no, first dot there is wrong, emergent, that's not there. It does an server config.tcp on the domain. And as a result, we're getting back a URL that we're going to query, which has a JSON document, which I'm going to come to. If that is not working, so this is covering the ISP case. So if Yahoo or Google want to support that, they can set this this record, point to the JSON file, done. That doesn't solve the hoster case. And like I'm hosting my email address at Office 365 or at Google or at Domain Factory. And often they don't have the ability to set DNS records for the customer because these might be existing domains. They have existing 2 million domains, and I cannot go to all the customers and say, hey, please change your DNS record, because they're not in charge of that. Obviously, the website of Microsoft is not hosted by the same, or Cisco is not hosted by the same. So for deployment or for rollout, it's going to be important to have some other mechanism, how we can find the domain hoster, or the email hoster rather. And we can do that via the MX record. Can you go to the next one? So we just make an MX lookup for the domain, and that should be theoretically correct in 99% of the cases, because the MX is where the emails go to. So we know for sure this is the guy who hosts the email. There's some corner cases which we discussed where this is not going to work. For example, if there's proxy inbound MX server in the front, which is, for example, doing spam filtering. So if I'm telling whatever MailChimp or whatever to do my mail filtering and then route the emails back to me, then this is not going to work. But that's a very rare case. This is something like 1% of the domains. And from that, we're getting the MX host name, and then we can go to the next slide. We look up again DNS server, this time with the MX host name, the full host name. We discussed using just the domain, but some people here who are running servers made a very convincing argument that we can just take the whole host name. And we're making a lookup. That's almost the same lookup. We just add the MX that gives the chance to have different URLs based on whether you're querying directly the domain or the MX. And that allows to have different hosts for DreamHost at DreamHost and the customers of DreamHost. And it also allows better tracking because the MX is going to get a duplicate of many of the requests. And I can more easily do statistical logging what the people are querying for, which domains they're querying for. Next one. So both of them are giving back a URL. And I'm getting this kind of JSON here, which contains the entire configuration. It is supposed to give me all the configuration that I need to configure this email client, this email account and this client, including all the protocols, all the resources that I have available connected to that account. We're going to look into the details. Next slide, please. So first, the authentication. There's multiple options how I can authenticate. And it's the client which chooses which format it's going to choose based on its own capabilities. Clients that are supporting OAuth might be preferring OAuth over password, and try the issue ID. And the issuer here allows me to go to OpenID Connect, discover all the metadata about the OAuth server, and then find the corresponding configuration where I'm supposed to log in. The scopes are not in here because they're going to be defined by the other document that Neil is going to present in a minute. So this is going to be a very formalized one, and whatever OAuth server is here has to forcefully comply with the spec that Neil is going to present. Otherwise, it's not. The clients are supposed to ignore that OAuth server if the server is not compliant to that. Next one, we have password obviously, and we can add other authentication methods here. So if a client supports only passwords, he's going to go there and try to authenticate there. The server can decide what it puts in there. So if the server says, I'm not allowing password authentication, the password thing is not going to be in there. And clients who don't support OAuth are going to be out of luck. That might be a problem at some point. Any questions up to this point?
Aren't do you have any kind of policy there, like we do support passwords still, but we really want to phase them out, use this other thing if you can?
We discussed that to make a policy and priority order there. If you have a strong argument for it, the argument was the client is going to choose whatever they want anyway. So
yeah, okay. Question was stupid because there is really only one example, namely we want to get rid of plain text password. So you could also solve the same thing by saying clients that support something else should prefer something else, because there's really only one use for this feature.
Yeah, can we take that to the list? We're going to run
Yep.
short on time here.
Right.
Thank you.
okay, next slide then. So the project, this is how I can connect to the actual email service. I can have IMAP in there, JMAP, SMTP here. Submission should have an S at the end. And CardDAV, CalDAV, WebDAV, I can add additional services that I want to configure together with this email client because I want to sync my contacts as well, not just my email address. IMAP this is now in URL form, so it's always going to be IMAP S, and the port is obviously optional. It's going to be assumed 993, and I can take the host name out of this. And most of the other protocols, and it's the same for SMTP. It's going to be assumed 465, and all the others are using HTTPS anyway. And the client is supposed to enforce that this is secure in HTTPS and TLS. And we're only doing TLS, direct TL or implicit TLS, not as start SMTP, start TLS as bye-bye, not supported. Next one. There's some additional metadata about the provider here, which might help clients to set up the account in a nice way. The client might want to say, this is your Gmail account with a little Gmail logo, or your iCloud account with your iCloud logo. This can be put in here. It's up to the client how he uses that. He might put the email address in the account as account name, or the provider, or both, or depending on whether I have 2 Gmail accounts, it's up to the client. There's a support URL, which is for end users, which can be shown in case there's problems. For example, if I'm failing to log in, the client can show this URL, and it can show, hey, you need to log in, go to settings, go there, enable IMAP, and nonsense like this. Or your account is blocked, click here, and it can have links in there. Developer URL is not supposed to be shown to the end users. This is a contact if, as a client developer, I'm seeing that the configuration is wrong, it's outdated, and I want to contact the ISP, hey, the information you're publishing here is wrong. How can I reach them? I'm not going to succeed by calling their hotline. Next one. So with this, I can go to IMAP and SMTP. I already talked about that. Next. I can configure CardDAV, CalDAV, WebDAV, or next I can configure JMAP. And inline in the protocol in JMAP, I can discover whether I have access to mail calendar or not. That might be account specific. Some accounts might have it, some not. I think that's it. That's the end.
Yep, that's it.
So to clarify, there's going to be 2 RFCs coming out. One is documenting the existing protocol as it is being used by mail clients right now. That's almost done. This is a new proposal to do it the IETF way.
Thanks, Ben. Any general comments on that? We don't need to bash the details until Ben actually gets something on paper, at least as far as I'm concerned. Ron,
Maybe this is a process question. Can we publish an informational RFC from this working group without needing to have multiple implementations? I guess there are already multiple implementations for this thing. So
Just 10.
yeah, so
yeah.
we can say that's
Our
fine.
AD
Murray's
is
nodding.
shaking his head affirmative.
Informational should be fine. Cool.
Good question. Thank you, Brian. Any other comments on this? Great. Thank you, Ben. Okay. Ernst, you are up.
Well, you already know that I'm not making 100% sense today. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. So about that. I have 2 documents right now. It should be one, I personally think. Go on. They solve much the same problem. One of them is reluctance to implement the syntax in the EAI RFCs, specifically the local part syntax. I've run into too many people who either pretty much cannot or more often will not implement local parts that contain the full Unicode. And I see their point. Second, we have a divergence right now between IETF and W3C email syntaxes. The W3C has a syntax of its own based on a regex in HTML forms. I'd like to have only one source of truth for Unicode addresses. Next, please. So the goal to my documents are to get rid of some of the wilder parts of UTF-8. This is where John interrupted me 4 months ago. We've spoken about it. At the moment, you can do pretty much anything you want in local parts, and you can be so inventive that many mail readers that contain code that just concatenates strings and displays something can show strange combinations, can be persuaded to show a domain that isn't really there, and so on. It's not terribly difficult to construct something where you have at local part domain or the other way around. Bad, shouldn't have that. I said I'd like to merge the syntaxes so that there is only one source of truth. That would also, with luck, we might get rid of the 8-year-old issue over at the W3C. And I'd like to have all of this really simple to implement. I want to have small diffs for code. Part of my job is to send in such diffs, and I want them to be small. Next. I suggested about half of this in Vancouver. John interrupted at length. We've discussed it since. John was more right than I was. What I have now is 2 documents. I'd really like it to be the text in the 2 documents, but in 1 document. John might disagree about the 1 document, 2 document thing. I'm not quite sure. But we pretty much agree about the content. Next. The first part concerns addresses in general. I want to restrict the address syntax from RFC 6531-32 a little bit, not very much. I want to have one syntax for all the world, nothing that requires a lot of regional knowledge. This leaves a syntax which isn't quite user-friendly. It permits addresses that no human being can read. For example, because you have an Inuktitut local part and a Han Chinese domain. No human can combine those. Pretty sure. However, the addresses are safe to render. Simple code written today will be able to render this in such a way that it will not confuse people. You cannot persuade even a client like Mutt to mix two addresses on screen, even though they really are different addresses. The comma between the addresses will be in the right place. This syntax should support things like Zendesk, Mailman, not MailMaint, Mailman, sorry. I originally did not want to cover those. John persuaded me that I was wrong. For this, I need a small change to 6532, I think, but it may be 31. That's in the document you see at the end. Next. The part that I care more about concerns the kinds of addresses that people use. That concerns me more because that's where I've had more pushback. This is the kind of email addresses that we all use when we sign up on when we sign up on Data Tracker or on Amazon. This is the kind of address that companies generate automatically for all employees in their enterprise email system. It's a bit more, what I want there is a bit more restricted. I want it restricted enough that every address is readable for someone. You can't combine Inuktitut, which is script used in Canada, with Balinese, not used in Canada. You can pretty much only have addresses that at least one person on this globe can read. That also makes them safe to cut and paste. The renderers will draw them on screen such that people know where the address starts and ends and can make sense of it, blah, blah. Really all very nice. There's a small price to pay in terms of implementation complexity. Next. Couple of things that I cared about, coming to both of them. The rule sets are simple to understand. This has been a problem for me. People who are developers need to understand Unicode email addresses well enough to feel confident about doing it. And that applies doubly to security. I'm not sure. Maybe people are cowards, but they really don't want to do anything shady. You've seen the same thing on last call for some documents. People are nervous about strange Unicode features. Both of them allows all of the addresses that I think people are using somewhere. And by now I have spoken to people who ought to know in every country where this has production use, except one. I've never been to Tehran. I don't see myself traveling there very soon. They might be doing something I don't know. But for the rest of the world, I'm fairly confident that I know what people are doing. Next. So I'm asking for working group adoption. Either just the document that John wants or a merged one, including something such that we can have one source of truth. First, a set of ground rules that apply to all Unicode email addresses, and then a section saying these additional restrictions are recommended for human people. That will produce addresses that are safe to cut and paste, that kind of thing. Still a minute and a half left. Questions? John?
Since great deal of this has been blamed on me, I thought I should comment. First of all, I've come to the conclusion that the very liberal syntax which was adopted by the EAI working group was probably a mistake. So the first part of this should clear that up and tighten things up is certainly a good idea, independent of any of the rest of this. The reason why I've been arguing for separating these two things is precisely there, and goes back to a document we probably should have written 25 years ago and never have, which is that there are reasons for deliberately obscure local parts and email addresses. Arguably, anytime somebody puts in a name followed by some sort of hash string to identify a particular message in the local part, they're going down that path toward a deliberately obscure message. Whether this is intended for human users or not is almost irrelevant question. So it seems to me we've got two separate issues here. One of them is the over-liberal SMTP UTF-8 syntax, which we should fix as a matter of SMTP UTF-8 interoperability, but we should make that no more restrictive than is needed to be to get out of the if you use that address for any purpose you're crazy situation. The second is if this is one human communicating with another human, this is the way to stay out of trouble. I think that document is very useful, again, even independent of the non-ASCII character problem. So I think these things are both worthwhile. I'm in favor of this working group or somebody else taking both of them up, but I think we need to think about them a little bit differently. Whether that means one document or two documents is ultimately a RFC user experience question. But with the way we're organized, if something is going to be labeled as updating the basic as SMTP UTF-8 documents, then it should not go off into excursions about advice for good practices and addresses. So that's the argument, whether one likes it or not. Thanks. I think those are details which, if the working group takes them up, we can work out later.
Yep. Thank you, John. Yes, I agree. If the working group decides to take on the work, we'll probably keep them separate for now. And as they progress, we'll determine if we want to merge them. Jim, you wanted to channel something from Jabber?
Yeah, from Jabber, Kazunori Fujiwara says the single script rule is harmful. Japanese uses Han plus katakana plus hiragana plus ASCII.
Yep.
Did you want to respond to that?
Right. Japanese is a bit of a special case there. Input methods, consider those four to be one script, and I think this document should follow along with that. In an input method, when you change script, you change to one name, which is really those four scripts. He's quite right. There are also a couple of other similar things, minor details, that need exposition.
Alexi, real quick.
Just follow up. Maybe use this as an example and explain what you mean by single script, because other people, like when I saw the questions, like, I don't know, I'm not fluent enough in Unicode terminology to know that That is
Yeah.
actually okay.
It's will do.
Okay, thank you, Art. We need to move on. Neil.
Okay, I don't think there's too much to say about this one. Basically, we realized that we're using a bunch of keywords in our own client that were not registered. If you go to the next slide, please. We should register those things. That's why we have a registry, because it's being a good internet system, which is something we care about at Fastmail, but also to mainly avoid conflicts, which is, again, the point of registry, so that we don't have other people using the same keywords for different things. And also so that if people do want to interoperate, we document, how we're using these. And some of them are quite likely to be useful to others to interoperate. Some are fairly specific to us and less likely. Either way, we thought it was worthwhile registering them. I think it's likely to be an informational document, if anything, because we're not going to change how we're using these, because we've got a lot of hard-coded keywords in there. Go to the next slide, please. So yeah, some of these things might be useful to other clients. I've just noted a few of those here. Notify, which is just a keyword kind of set via your rules or via the server, and it's a signal to clients. You should show a user notification when a new message arrives with this keyword. Lets you configure controls over notifications kind of more precisely in a way that's going to work across all your clients. Mute and follow, which is a feature across quite a lot of email providers now. Again, where you add a keyword and then any new message that arrives in that thread some action will be applied by the server, for example, just to skip your inbox if it's muted. And memos is what we call being able to kind of add a little sticky note onto an email, and the way it's done in our implementation is just another email that's uploaded that's in the same thread and has a particular keyword on it, and it's in reply to the message that you're putting the memo on. So again, that could be implemented by any IMAP or JMAP client without any kind of custom server support. If they want to interoperate, cool. If they don't, it just appears as a normal message in the thread, so users can still see it, but that's why we did it that way. And again, so those are some of the keywords, and there's some that get less useful, like I think it's trusted and stuff, which is a bit weird. It's kind of how we set it if we sent the message and stuff. But I guess all I'm really looking for is yeah, what the next steps are with this. I think generally people I've spoken to, it's like, well, yep, fine, we can register those and move on. Any comments, I guess?
Ben?
Ben Mustang, sorry. I have not seen the spec yet, but are you clearly defining the semantics of all of those as well? Because in order to interoperable, we need to agree what notify is. We need to agree what mute means, what I'm muting, and so on.
There is, I mean, you can have a look at the spec and see, but yeah, it's meant to have enough detail to kind of be broadly interoperable.
Great idea.
Brown.
Sorry, I was busy typing notes as well. I noticed that Daniel sent another keyword registration draft to the list just recently. I think we should do a wrap up registering all the known keywords out there. Job, I still think informational is the right place to do it, but I support adopting one of those drafts.
I'm happy to merge them together if
into one.
Daniel wants to, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, from this chair, I agree. Alexi.
Yeah, I just want to show my support for I encourage chairs to ask for adoption. Not in the room, but on the mailing list.
John Clinton.
In the light of the previous conversation, and outreach and inclusivity, are we going to allow non-ASCII keywords and perhaps even non-ASCII definitions of those keywords? And if the answer is no, then as this work develops, and I'm in favor of the working group developing it, we better put closer boundaries on what it is we're talking about than where the first slide started, which is register everything.
Replying, John. No, IMAP and JMAP don't support non-ASCII keywords.
Don't think so. Also, it's not relevant to this. This is not about arbitrary keywords.
It's not an
purely about
arbitrary annotation on the message.
Yeah.
It's a thing with semantic meaning.
Yeah.
And it's documented existing practice, which
Yes.
is why it's going to be informational. We're not trying to standardize it per se. We're just trying to reserve these keywords in the registry so there's no future collisions.
That's dandy. But again, if you're allowing new keywords to be registered, you need to think very carefully about how far you want to go. That's all.
What?
That's well out of scope, John, to this. We are registering things in an existing registry, which has limitations. If you want to propose opening up the definition of that registry, that's a completely different set of work, which I don't suspect there's much interest in from anyone other than you, but feel free to propose it.
No, I'm not interested in it. I'm not trying to propose it. My impression from the slides and presentation, having not read the draft, is that this opens up a slippery slope. If it doesn't, wonderful.
Ken, seriously, can we
All right, let's move on.
please read drafts and this?
Yeah, John, I don't think we're opening up anything here. That the specifications of the registries are already documented in other specifications. We're just claiming a few names for things that have already been implemented.
That's fine. Apologies for interrupting.
Anything else on this? I'll take this to the list and see if we want to have one document that gathers up all existing uses of keywords just to register them.
And does this go through just procedurally as a MAILMAINT document, or is AD sponsored, or what's the thing? I don't know. I'm just asking what's the.
No, I think it can be a
just go through
MAILMAINT
as MAILMAINT.
document.
Great, fine, easy.
Presumably will have multiple authors and each will contribute what they
Yeah,
the particular
Yeah.
uses are. Okay, move on to OAuth. Neil?
Yep. Okay. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? So, passwords are a problem. You can't do 2FA, passkeys, single sign-on, or various other more secure things. If every device is using the same password, you can't detect if a new device has appeared. You can't revoke access to just one device. If that one's compromised, you have to revoke all of them and get everything to relog in again. And that password often gives you way more access than necessarily what that client needs. It may only need your email, but that password may give you access to your contacts, your calendars, your files, the corporate directory, all sorts of other things. So for many reasons, people would like to get rid of just logging in with a username and password in most services, and we've seen this kind of across the web. But in email, and also actually in your kind of contacts and calendar clients, standard CardDAV, the only kind of interoperable way of doing this at the moment is just a basic username password. So that's a problem. And I think if we go to the next slide. Thank you. Oh, sorry. That's just going with what I said. Can't remember my slides now. Next one, please. I think OAuth is the only viable kind of solution to this right now. And it's what we're seeing adopted already by the large providers, Google and Yahoo and Outlook, that can kind of essentially dictate to clients to add support to it. But there's no interoperable way to do this at the moment because you need a client ID, which needs pre-registration, and you need often to know exactly the way that the OAuth has been configured at the other provider, at that host. We need something that doesn't require any pre-existing relationship between the client and the server, because otherwise it would not scale to all of the email servers and email clients out there. So what we've come up with is a profile of OAuth which solves this. And in particular, it does not define anything new. It is only using existing IETF standards and mandating certain options and requirements in how you kind of support them so that we can make an interoperable profile that meets these needs of not requiring pre-registration. So I'll give a brief overview of how it works. if you go to the next slide, please. And next one. So step 0, auto config. This is not essential, but again, we think this is mostly how it's going to work. This is what Ben was presenting earlier. The goal here is that from a user's point of view, they just type in an email address and then everything else kind of is worked out for them. It goes, oh, your email is hosted at Fastmail, say, pops up the Fastmail login that they're used to, the Fastmail website, they log in, click yes, they want to allow, and they're done. And that's it. So step 0, auto config to find the OAuth issuer, which is essentially just a URL. Otherwise, they could, I guess, manually configure this, but we expect that to be rare. Then next slide, please. So after that, they have an issuer. From this, there's a well-known path you can add onto it to fetch the OAuth metadata. This is RFC 8414. You'll see the references at the top of all the slides. This is a standard JSON format, which contains a bunch of information about how the OAuth server is configured. And the specification, this profile mandates certain options be supported so that clients can know how they're going to use this in the flow. It's just a static JSON file. It's very easy for the server to support. We're going to also define in this document a registry of scopes for IMAP, SMTP, JMAP. You'll just essentially use the capabilities so that, again, there's interoperable scopes as well. All right, so we've got the OAuth metadata in our client. Next slide, please. We now need to get a client ID. For this, we'll use dynamic client registration, which is RFC 7591. Again, the client's just going to send a JSON file, which is kind of a static file they can build in at compile time to the endpoint that's given from the metadata, and the server will return them a client ID. And this registration will include their name, version, redirect URI endpoints, and stuff which the server will need to, when they're like granting authorization, to say who's asking for permission and that kind of thing. So the important thing here is the client can only register redirect URIs that are either at the loopback address or that use a private use scheme. And this means that only native clients that run on the user's device will be able to complete this particular OAuth flow, this profile. If this profile was supported for web apps, it would be unfortunately too easy to phish users. But if the user's already downloaded and run an app, then, well, that could obviously just be malware already. It could pop up a browser window that was indistinguishable from the user's real one and phish them like that. You're not weakening security at that point. Okay, so we've got a client ID. Next slide, please. Now we're doing the authorization code grant flow, which is the most common OAuth flow. And this is the thing that you do every provider already. If you've ever added support for OAuth, probably this is in 6749, the base OAuth 2.0 spec. Essentially, the client just opens the user's browser at the auth endpoint with a few parameters added. The user will go do whatever they do there, grant access, and if it's successful, you'll get an authorization code back at your redirect URI endpoint. We've tried to reduce the options again here, both to make it more secure as far as we can and easier to interoperate. So we've mandated PXE, which is essentially you send a code challenge, a hash of the code challenge with it, and then when you swap your authorization code later, you're going to send the original code challenge back with that, which lets you make sure that if anything steps it along the way, it can't exchange this authorization code for the refresh code. And a few other extensions that OAuth provides that we can mandate to make it more secure. But that's details. Please look at the spec itself if you're interested in that. Okay, next slide, please. Just finally what happens. So yes, we get this authorization code back, and the client sends this authorization code to the server and gets back access and refresh tokens. And these it can then use to authenticate whether over IMAP or SMTP or JMAP or whatever. There's the SASL OAuth bearer already for IMAP and SMTP. And for the HTTP protocols, it's just a standard authorization header with the bearer token. So that's kind of the proposal. We think there's quite a lot of interest in this in both, well, mailbox providers in particular, and also in clients, because mailbox providers keep badgering them about it, but also because it's going to make it easier for them to, for users to set up the clients with the server, and also more secure. You know, clients don't want to be holding on to passwords and other kind of credentials like that, because, you know, that's a security risk, and they don't want that either. So that's the proposal. We're, I think, looking for call for adoption. Yeah, I think I presented this at the OAuth group at the last IETF, and because there's no new OAuth stuff, they were happy for us to do this kind of as part of the MAILMAINT group instead. We'll obviously send it through to the OAuth main list for review before it gets finalized when we're kind of near the end, but that's proposal. Okay, any questions? Barry?
They're right. The chairs in the auditorium are much more comfortable. This is one just based on the conversation I'm seeing bouncing around where I'd like to see some discussion about whether this is too big for MailMaint, like whether it should get its own working group or possibly go to OAuth. I don't have an opinion about that. I feel like this is one where we're dabbling right along that line here.
Neil and I had lunch with Hannes, the OAuth work group chair yesterday, and he's more than happy to get this off their plate. So yes,
Yeah.
They said they've got too much going on already. He felt that this was just scoped to email. We weren't adding anything new to OAuth. He thought this was a good place for it. If you disagree, that's totally fine.
It is definitely scoped for email, but is it too big for the charter that we have here? This charter is meant to constrain this to sort of like simple little things, and this doesn't seem like a simple little thing. But I'm happy to have that be a consensus decision.
Jim?
Hi, Jim Fenton. Comment and a couple of questions.
Hmm.
One is that I want to make sure that we're not confusing OAuth with an authentication protocol. I mean, you talked about, passwords, perhaps giving access to a bunch of other things. Anything else that you could use password to give you access to OAuth, to authenticate, to have your IDP generate an OAuth token. But really we kind of need to keep those separate. So the question part of this is, does the way that you've got this envisioned, is the scope of the token that's generated something that's very specific for accessing to email as opposed to something else in the domain?
Yes, because I mean, and then to a large extent, this is kind of a standard bit of OAuth is you would request which scopes you would like your token to have access for, and you would be expected to only ask for the ones that you are going to need. And even beyond that, like often it's not possible to ask for every scope that the password itself has access to. If you log in with the password directly to a provider's website, there are things they may not provide an API for at all, but it gives you access for those. So yes, the point is that the client's not storing this password, which has so much more privilege, if you like, than the access tokens. You also, with the tokens you have both access and refresh tokens, and the refresh token allows you to detect if it has been stolen and duplicated elsewhere, which we can't tell from the password. So
or at least to minimize its validity if it's used elsewhere. Okay, and then kind of a comment on what we were just talking about in terms of working groups and so forth. Just noting that we have a working group for using TLS for applications. Maybe there needs to be a using OAuth for applications.
I suspect it's mostly going to be the same people here, and in that respect, it would be a lot easier just to keep with this working group. But
yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe talk with Aaron or somebody and find out whether he's getting similar requests from other places as well.
John?
This may be another ignorant question because I don't understand what's going on, because I've been paying too much attention to some other email spec, which is basically irrelevant and less important than this. This feels like, and this is sort of borrowing from something Keith said in the chat, like we're making very, very strong assumptions about what an MUA or an email reader client is like. This is lightweight if it's a web implementation. It's very heavyweight if it's not. And neither of those is a problem unless we start having the servers to which those things are communicating making strong assumptions which would exclude some of those options and while promoting others. And again, that may be a stupid question, but it seems relevant, and And it also seems a little bit relevant to scoping whether this working group is appropriate.
I think there's 2 points on that, although Bron looks like he wants to make a comment as well. Firstly, the vast majority of clients, this is straightforward. In fact, the vast majority, they already have this. It just only works with Google and Yahoo. So, in that respect, I don't think there's an implementation difficulty for most things. And the second point is, the email ecosystem is a broad scope. It's not saying this is the only way you'll ever be able to authenticate. For some providers, it might be, but then that provider may not be for you if that's what if you have different needs. Not everything needs to serve everyone, but this serves a real need for a lot of people.
I can agree with that, and I guess I'm singing the same song over and over again, but I'm very, very concerned about our accelerating the rate at which we are squeezing ourselves down to a small number of providers, a small number of ways of doing things. And anytime you say the vast number of things do it this way, and therefore it's okay, the corollary to almost all statements like that is making it progressively harder for people to do it any other way. And that concerns me, if only for old fogey historical reasons.
That's precisely what I was coming up here to say. The fact that we don't have something like this is forcing people down to a limited number of providers, because the only way to get anything other than storing an incredibly dangerous password on your device is to use one of these few providers that will make an agreement with you. It requires the N times M agreements at the moment to get anything other than password, because there's no standard protocol. And to echo what Neil said, this is what I have seen in my time at IETF as a fairly common failure mode, which is emphasizing and focusing on the edge cases at the expense of the common case working at all. And so we are so concerned about dealing with every possibility that we don't produce anything.
Just, to expand on that very slightly, there's a number of fields now where it's mandated that you must have 2FA to protect your email and stuff because of various breaches and such. At the moment, that basically forces those companies that have this legislation to use Google or Microsoft, because they're the only ones that have OAuth support in all the clients because of the scale and the way you have to set everything up manually at the moment. So this is doing the opposite. This is increasing interoperability and increasing the chance of a diverse ecosystem.
Pete?
So watching the conversation on the list and watching the conversation right now in the chat, I think you do need to address in this document somewhere if OAuth is really a protocol, and the use of OAuth in this way is really a protocol, it cannot depend on the particular implementation of I'm calling out to an OS web browser that's going to support JavaScript and all the other stuff that web browsers support in order to pull this off. Because then you're pulling into the protocol a bunch of user implementation that doesn't belong there. OAuth, the current OAuth protocol doesn't include all that stuff, but some uses of OAuth do. And that's what Keith is getting wound around, and I think you need to comb that out.
I don't think you can comb that out. Like that is a reasonably modern browser is kind of expected for a lot of providers, and to a certain extent that's going to again depend on who you host your mail with. If they support their flow with in a way that works with IE6, well, maybe that'll work for you, but most won't.
But that is not protocol. So how to get into using OAuth is one thing. How to get into Microsoft's particular implementation of OAuth is a different
Okay, well, I think we're talking about completely different things now then, because that
right.
What we're not. This is the whole point. Is this is a standard way that is not just how Microsoft does OAuth. This is.
I absolutely agree. I'm saying there is something that's being confused in this discussion that at least Keith is hearing that I don't think is necessarily part of the protocol. But I think you have to be careful to be clear that what we are doing is doing the OAuth exchange here, and not depending on a particular implementation of OAuth. I think
What do you mean by a particular implementation of OAuth, I guess?
insofar as you're pulling a URL that says, here's how to go connect to the OAuth server, peachy, I don't care,
Yep.
right? That's just going to a URL.
Yep.
And the OAuth spec tells you how to do the exchange with
Yep.
the thing you're talking to.
Yep.
Okay. The OAuth spec does not say, here is where to ask the web browser to put in your username and password from your
No.
right.
not-
And the spec shouldn't refer to that. I'm saying what you need to be clear on to satisfy the kinds of concerns that Keith is bringing up is, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing the user interface thing. We're strictly sticking to the protocol.
Okay,
and-
and just clear, like, what you mean by we're not doing that, because you would never do that as part of OAuth, in that you open the browser to the provider site, and it's up to them how they actually authenticate you. And at the end of the process, if you've authenticated and authorized, then you get the token back. But are you suggesting we mandate anything in terms of what happens inside the, your host's or
I
authentication?
think that's
host website?
OAuth's problem, not yours.
This seems like a straw man argument here. Maybe I'm missing something.
Don't say you open the browser. You open a connection to the OAuth server. What you then have to exchange with the OAuth server is someone else's problem.
George Michelson, AP. So if you said this was,
George, you didn't.
I'm sorry, you're right. It's managed queue. I'll put a request into the queue.
Thank you. Ben, you're next.
So first, to directly respond to John, the problem right now is that's a real thing that many companies are moving to Office 365 exactly because they don't want to do passwords, and that's the only way they can get the OAuth and mail clients. So this is helping with this. So this is why this is a good thing, because it opens up to more people. On the other hand, what Pete said is a real problem. You don't have that problem at Fastmail maybe with your web client, but email clients have that problem very much. That OAuth is a framework. It says you can do it this way or this way or this way, but it's not narrowed down. The good thing in this specification is it narrows down a very many things that the OAuth framework leaves open. You're narrowing this down. This is a very important component of the work that we're doing with this specification. So this is a good thing. This is progress. But that's a very important component to nail this down and say you must do it this way, this way, this way. So
Yes.
this is good. But still, even all that being done, there's still the thing that Pete said, that as a mail client, I'm required to have a Chrome browser. Or if I'm lucky, I can use a Safari or a Firefox, and that's it. So we're very much dependent on a specific implementation. And that scope, what is happening in that mail browser, is completely undefined. And that is a problem. That is not a protocol. You cannot just say, go to a browser, not my problem. Happens, but it is a problem of the mail client, because I need to know, do I need to support cookies? How long do I need to stare at the cookies?
You shouldn't support anything.
Let-
You
let
should
me
pass it
finish.
over to the
Let me-
OS's browser. They
let
can
me-
deal
let
with
me-
that.
No, that's the thing. No, I cannot. This is my business. This is my login. I need to take care of that. And you cannot just say, go to the web browser, because I need to call the web browser. I need to come back to that. I need to make sure which browser it is. I don't know which browser I'm going to get. I need to manage this. And the thing that Keith had to point in one thing, I have no control over who's my mail provider. You seem to say, okay, just use a mail provider that suits you. I'm working at a company and they decide which mail provider I'm using. I don't have a choice in that. And for example, for myself, I don't want to ever authenticate to Google in my web browser, in my main web browser, ever. So that is not an option. Sorry, that's not your, I'm sorry, but this is not your place to say that I need to make a new job. I'm serious, but this is too much.
Hey, we've, yeah.
So
No
so
cross
the-
banner, please.
I'm just
follow
saying
the queue.
this is a very real thing. I'm forced to authenticate with OAuth, and I don't want to. So there needs to be a barrier between my web browsing stuff and my email stuff. These are two different things, and we cannot collate them. So I need to know what in the browser, what needs to be supported. Does it need support whatever web authn? Does it need support video? Does it need support web RTC? And all this kind of stuff. And this is a real problem for me as a client implementer.
Well, yeah, firstly, if it's a company email, then they're probably going to mandate what clients they want you to support anyway. And if you have a problem with your client, you can talk to your company help desk and they may not or may not support it. So yeah, that's not really relevant. And again, like, it seems such a small man thing. You will use, the OWASP thing. Sure, they might. And if they mandate Outlook, nothing we can do is going to change that. That is what their company policy is. Companies can set their own policies about what they choose to do. Again, like you say, like, oh, it only works in Chrome. That, again, has not been something I've seen a lot in practice. But if it does, again, that's a problem with your provider, and nothing we can say is gonna fix that. Anyway, Arndt?
Right. Much of the same as Ben said, really, except slightly different viewpoint. I wrote an OAuth client on a memory restrained device. Knowing what was required for interoperability was important in order to be able to write unit tests and have confidence in my implementation. And I do think that this specification needs some sort of statement on what the web browser needs to be able to do.
Yep. Yeah, I think you can certainly have some recommendations. I think it's going to be hard to say like normative stuff there necessarily. Yeah, that's fine.
Brian, are you back in the queue?
I think I covered most of it, but the thing that I'd like to say on all of this is it's not mandatory to do this. It's solving a really common use case, and it's solving a really common use case that users want. And I think that's something we need to take into account when we're working here is what's going to get use, and designing a perfect protocol that handles the edge cases and will work when you want to invoke links from the command line to do your OAuth flow is fine, but that's not going to get use. And right now what we have is that people can OAuth to Google, they can OAuth to Yahoo, they can OAuth to iCloud, they can OAuth to Microsoft, and no, they can't connect to anybody else. And this is creating exactly the situation we claim to be wanting to not create, and yet we are putting roadblocks in the way of not creating it to the point that that is what we are creating. So it's worth looking at the results of our work as well as the theoretical of it.
George and then Daniel.
I apologize for my preemptive attack on the queuing protocol. I think this conversation is very strange because I am using a mechanistic approach to bind to Microsoft that does not require use of any authorized, permitted, or mandated browser. It is simply a protocol exchange over HTTPS TLS that generates a cookie state that is then used as cookie state to carry forward asserts that I need to do my mail fetch. I'm not constrained in ways that people are applying or anathema. So I get the call to say we must not make it possible for people to say you must use Edge, but we actually can't stop them saying that. The observation I make is essentially what I think Bron is saying. This is a protocol of use. And this idea that it axiomatically leaks huge amount of information, well, that's an artifact of the implementations that abound in browsers like Safari or Edge or Chrome, and behaviors by Google that have nothing to do with the fundamental identity and proof exchange, the MFA component that allows me to do mail. I'm not using those browsers. I am fetching my mail from Microsoft. It works. I would like this to be a standard that would allow other mail providers like Proton or Fastmail to do the same thing.
Thank you, George. Daniel?
Daniel here. I think most people agree that OAuth isn't the perfect world, but it's just moving things forward from passwords that is both a push from providers and users. And it's, if somebody wants to come up with something that's better than OAuth, I think we'd all be happy, but that's sort of tangent to this.
That's, yeah, OAuth is the only path forward in any reasonable amount of time. And if something else better comes along later, great, we'll adopt that and we can transition to that afterwards. But saying, oh, we're going to spend 10 years coming up with something that might be better rather than doing something better right now is not the right move.
Okay, we've run out of time for that. We'll take this to the list and see if there's interest in adopting this as a starting point.
Thank you.
Bron.
All right, thank you. Next slide, please. Actually, just before we go on quickly, just looking at the identity of the people who are on there. The reason why this didn't get done at the all dispatch was that we weren't ready in time, and we weren't ready in time because we had people from big companies who had to get sign off from their legal to publish this document, so it wasn't published in time. We got it in just before the draft deadline, but that meant that we were too late for all dispatch, unfortunately. So that's why we're here. Yes, next slide, please. So DKIM 2 is basically looking at real world experience with DKIM at scale and saying there's a couple of significant problems, one of which is replay, another one is backscatter and the related wish for asynchronous spam scanning. A lot of providers of all different sizes would love to be able to receive an email, look at it, decide whether to accept it or whether to bounce it asynchronously rather than having to do it at connection time. What we do instead is grey listing, which is awful and horrible and makes email much worse. If you could instead accept the email at the end rather than rejecting it and having it sent again across the wire, much better. Reversible modification algebra is something related, but kind of at the side here. One of the big problems with ARC is that if an email has been changed more than once or been changed at all, you have no idea whether it's the same email or a completely different email that's just had the headers glued on the top to pretend that it came from the original source, because the hashes don't line up anymore. With the modification algebra, you can inspect and see what changes different hops made to see whether they are bad or not. We need to support mailing lists. We need to support forwarding services. The idea of saying DKIM1 accept or reject only has been a real problem for a whole stack of indirect mail flows. So we had to handle that. And also abuse reporting for intermediaries. At the moment, senders who are sending on behalf of a domain will often add multiple DKIM signatures, hundreds in some cases, though commonly it's 2, so that they get abuse reports. And it is unclear which is the real one and which is additional people wanting abuse reports along the way. So having taken that into account as well in the design. All right, next slide, please. So this grew out of the incendiary post that I made when I first saw ARC at my second ever IETF. I wrote an implementation of ARC. I looked at it. I said it's meaningless security theater for the following 2 reasons, which are both things that are solved by DKIM 2. Email mail path was an attempt a couple of years ago to do something like this, but not as deeply thought out. The DKIM replay problem statement, and there were also a couple of other drafts that were submitted to the DKIM replay group. This is combining the best of all of those. It's a discussion that's been had amongst the authors of those various drafts, other than Murray's one. Sorry, we didn't include you, Murray. We did decide it would be too much of a conflict of interest for you. But we should have. All right, next. So one of the goals is that we don't want to stop everything working. Things need to keep working that were written a long time ago, but if you wrote something that handles DKIM1 a couple of years ago, then you may need to upgrade over the next few years. We want to keep the cryptographic operations reasonable. It's not too complex. And we want to make it so that you can upgrade systems incrementally, and then once everything on a mail flow supports DKIM2, then you get all the properties. And until there, you get some of the properties, but not all the good bits. All right, these are the goals that were in the statement draft. I'm not going to read through them. Next slide, please. So we put together a draft charter. The main thing there is that design proposals here need to be tested, and tested at reasonable scale to make sure they work. We don't want to define a protocol that hasn't been tested and ship it out there. There's a draft that describes the problem and describes the proposed mechanism. I've written a draft describing an algebra. That one's certainly going to need a lot more debate before it goes anywhere. But do please read them and make comments on them anyway, because that starts the debate. We'll obviously need to update DMARC to say that DKIM2 is a way to say that email has been authenticated in the same way that ARC and DKIM1 are, but hopefully in such a way that you can specify no changes through a DKIM2 flow or allow changes, and the intermediates can see what's going to be accepted at the far end. All right. Now I added, yep, next slide, please. I think the goal for this is direct to a working group. I don't believe this group can take it on. Those comments earlier about OAuth, this is going to be significantly bigger than that. This is definitely well out of scope of this group. I would like to ask for a new working group. Murray, whether this falls under you, whether Ori would be a better person to speak to. Ask for comments on that in a second, I guess. I don't think there's any point in a BOF. There's clearly significant interest in this. I'm happy to have those significantly interested people come to the IETF and say, I'm significantly interested, if that would help. But there certainly is. If we do have to do a BOF, I think a virtual BOF before the next IETF, there's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of people already starting to write code for it. And I'd much rather have this happen at the IETF than be done off to the side, particularly because there are people who feel very uncomfortable doing any work that's not under IETF's IPR or under secrecy. And I'd prefer it to be under IETF's IPR rules than under secrecy, because that's going to get more input faster. I added a couple of bonus slides here as well, if we could have a look. This is what the algebra looks like roughly that I've put together. Basically, it takes the resulting body and says, if you make the following, if you copy the following byte ranges from it, and I didn't do an example that added text, unfortunately, in this, but there's also a way to add text in to say, I need to add this little line, but you don't want to be adding too much. Mostly you're cutting out the additional mailing list comment you put at the end or something. And then for the header, listing which headers you've replaced, and if you've changed the value of them, what the old value was, so that you can do a diff between them. And that's actually pretty lightweight. This is a test example, but I did take a couple of mailman emails that have been through the IETF mailing lists, and I took a Simper email and I ran this same algorithm on it, and it trims back. If it's something I've sent, I have the original as well. It comes back pretty well, unless you are re-encoding base 64 and the line lengths are different, then all bets are off. But otherwise, you can generally do a fairly quick diff. So long as you've got the output and the input email, you can work out what the difference between them is pretty well. And then final slide, I put together something just to show the mail flow. So the idea here is that the email goes, hopefully people can see on the video, it goes from a sender, in this case, through a mailing list and then through a forwarder to the final recipient. The big difference here is that rather than the bounce going straight back there, the bounce has to go back through the previous hops, and each hop has a signature from itself on the headers of the final email that they can say, yes, this definitely came through me. Even if they don't keep track of what's gone through, they can tell that this is something they should forward back, and that signature is going to include the address of the previous hop. So it can go all the way back. And this solves a bunch of problems. It solves backscatter entirely. You can delay a bounce and send it later, and that's still, for sure, they will know which email this is for. You can't falsify the backscatter because you won't send it back unless you can verify the signature as belonging to the previous hop. And it also means that this intermediate forwarder can be a completely privacy preserving forwarder for bounces, because when the bounce comes back to it, it can strip off any headers it's had added, and it can still send a bounce back to the previous hop, guaranteeing it just looks like it's bouncing it itself. And because bounces can be delayed, there's no difference between this site choosing an hour later to send back a bounce and the forwarder just saying, I decided an hour later to send back the bounce. There's no evidence of the previous hop, so you get better privacy preserving features as well. I think that's pretty much all I've got to say on it at the moment. The drafts are up there. The draft charter is there. I would love to make a working group. And Murray, do you want to say anything on this at the moment, how we should proceed?
for the people who were remote, this was presented. We were going to do this in all dispatch, but all dispatch was full. That's why the slides make it look a lot like this is a BOF present or a dispatch style presentation. This working group can't do that work. So I think the next steps are basically, if we have time on the agenda, you're free to discuss whatever the community might want to talk about. But as far as next steps for this work, I think we start preparing a BOF, whether that's an interim BOF, or if we decided we have to start the conversation with the ISG.
Right.
And figure out if we need to do a virtual BOF, if we want to hold it until Bangkok, or just go, and we can do that. But that's how you want to use the time. Apart from those questions,
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. If people want to talk about the technical details here, not procedural stuff, that's fine. Ben.
Conceptually looks cool. I just have a question about the format with the diffing thing, with the byte things.
Mhm.
Is it possible to also express that only with email headers, saying I replaced this header with that other header without messing with the byte ranges? Or was there a specific
Yes,
reason
if
why
you
you
could go
added
back
that?
one slide, please, Ken.
Is there a specific reason why you did the byte diffing? Because
Specifically, that is just for the body. The header is I replaced. Header is just a complete replacement. You say every header with this name got replaced with this text instead. So if there were multiple subject, which there can't be for these, but there were some cases where there could be things that had multiple headers, you have to say, I'm wiping all the current ones that are in there and putting these ones back instead. And you have to specify the complete headers in those cases.
Right.
We decided headers tend not to be big enough that it's a big problem just to give the whole header, and diff was tricky, but for the body, it's byte ranges or octet ranges.
I see. I guess it's not an option to forbid that, right?
Jim
Fenton. Just a comment that the algebra here gives me flashbacks to DKIM discussions about the L equals thing, which is, you could say, a very primitive sort of algebra for reversing a change from the mailing list. And all of the things that were contemplated, including, you mentioned base 64, different MIME types where, different parts of the message. So this I see as an extremely difficult problem to do well, and at the same time not open a door for abuse.
The alternative is to modify and just say I modified without showing. This at least shows that I've done this against a MIME wrapped message where it's wrapped in a multi-part mixed and there's a separate part placed at the end, which some mailing lists do. This also works quite well with that. The difference, of course, is that you have a different content type header because the MIME separator of the outside will be different. So you have to put another header in there, but it still makes quite a small change and it's quite clear. You can recreate the old message and then you can run whatever difference algorithm you like to detect what's actually different. The main thing is you can easily recreate the exact octets and same headers for all the headers that are DKIM signed, at least in the previous message, very easily.
Note that I didn't say it can't be done. I'm just, this is a tough problem.
I know. It's why it's in a separate draft, and it's not necessary for everything else.
While we've got a couple minutes, is there anybody who objects to the idea of having the conversation about this on the existing DKIM list, or do we really need a separate list? Right. Okay. But the nice thing is, like, it's already set up, and there's an audience that will be available. So we can take it there rather than doing it in MailMaint. The second thing is, from what I understand I haven't read your document, but I have an opinion.
Hey.
There's a certain component of this that happens at the SMTP layer where DKIM is entirely in headers.
We've
and bodies.
actually looked at this and decided it's not necessary. So the draft says that the previous revision of the draft said that. The current revision of the draft, we looked at it and said there's one case where it's beneficial to do things at the SMTP layer, and that is that you can tell whether you've exited the DKIM2 ecosystem intentionally or it's been replayed. But the problem is once you leave the DKIM2 ecosystem, you've already left the DKIM2 ecosystem.
Okay.
So it's going to be a replay either way. Just in one case, you could guarantee discarded as bad. And we decided that wasn't worth the cost of adding stuff to the SMTP layer.
Right.
This can entirely be done with headers.
Okay. The reason I brought that up is because the set of implementers for DKIM1 or DKIM was people who could write things to the Milter interface or plugins, or they didn't operate at the transport level. You got to bring in a different set of skills if you're going to start actually engaging with SMTP,
Yeah.
and it might limit you in some way. So I'm glad you've made that change.
The other change that I'm working on seeing whether we can do it or not is whether we can still have DKIM1 as the first hop under limited conditions and absorb it into this ecosystem. And my belief is that if it's DKIM1, if it covers all the headers that are necessary for DKIM2, and if the SMTP layer 2 address appears in the 2CC header on the email, then you could accept it into DKIM2 with the same guarantees that DKIM2 does. If it doesn't appear, if the SMTP level 2 address doesn't appear somewhere in a signed header, then it could be a replay. And so long as it appears somewhere, and DKIM2 guarantees it because it's added to the DKIM2 header. But if you don't have that, then it can be a replay and all bets are off.
Okay, thank you, Brown. And with that, we are out of time. Thank you, everybody. Reminder, if you are interested in any of these topics, please be active on the list. Silence does not help me determine whether we have consensus on various issues.
I read your badges and I like it.